This is not how empires announce their decline. There are no declarations, no ceremonies, no moments where power formally changes hands. History moves in quieter rhythms, a policy decision here, a supply chain adjustment there. And then one day, the world wakes up to discover that the architecture of influence has already been rebuilt, and no one thought to mention it. Most people believe that what happened in early 2025 was a trade dispute, a familiar pattern. Tariffs announced, diplomats dispatched, negotiations conducted, compromises reached, the kind of friction that has defined North American relations for decades without fundamentally altering the underlying structure of who needs whom. They are wrong. What occurred between February and December of 2025 was not a trade dispute that will be resolved through negotiation. It was a structural separation that cannot be reversed through policy. The United States, in pursuit of political theater, severed dependencies that had kept Canada economically aligned with American interests for generations. And Canada, recognizing that this separation was permanent, built the infrastructure to survive without American approval. By the time American policymakers understood what they had done, the alternative systems were already operational. The ports were already receiving cargo. The trade agreements were already signed. The supply chains were already redirected. This is where leverage quietly changes hands. For 8 decades, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been built on a simple premise. Canada possessed resources, America possessed markets. Canada extracted oil, minerals, agricultural products. America refined them, processed them, consumed them. The arrangement worked because Canada had no practical alternative. Geographic isolation, limited population, and economic integration meant that Canadian prosperity was tied to American demand. American policymakers understood this dependency and used it strategically. When disputes arose over softwood lumber, dairy quotas, or energy exports, the United States held the ultimate leverage. Where else could Canada sell? The Pacific was too distant. Europe required ocean crossings that made Canadian goods uncompetitive. The assumption was that Canada would always need American markets more than America needed Canadian resources. That assumption shaped decades of Canadian policy. Trade negotiations were conducted from a position of structural weakness. Diplomatic disagreements were resolved with Canadian concessions. Economic decisions prioritized access to American markets over all other considerations. Canada accepted the role of resource supplier because the alternative, economic isolation, seemed impossible. Then, in February 2025, the Trump administration imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and agricultural products, along with 15% tariffs on energy imports. The stated justification was national security. Canadian aluminum and steel were classified as threats under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. The psychological impact of that classification cannot be overstated. You do not classify your most important ally's industrial products as security threats unless you fundamentally view that country as adversarial. The message was clear. Canada could no longer be trusted. Canadian economic interests would be subordinated to American political priorities. The partnership was over. Washington expected the usual response. Canadian officials would arrive in Washington with proposed compromises. Trade negotiations would produce a modified agreement that preserved American leverage while providing Canadian concessions on dairy markets or pharmaceutical pricing. The relationship would continue on terms favorable to the United States. Instead, something unprecedented occurred. The Canadian public, without coordination or official direction, simply stopped engaging with the American economy. Travel to the United States declined by 37% within 6 weeks. Cross-border shopping, a tradition for millions of Canadian families living near the border, essentially ceased. Polling data showed that 68% of Canadians planned to avoid American goods and services indefinitely. This was not organized by the government. There were no official boycott declarations, no policy directives. This was a collective recognition that the relationship had fundamentally changed and that continued dependence on American goodwill represented an unacceptable vulnerability. American border communities experienced immediate economic damage. Shopping centers in Bellingham, Washington that had relied on Canadian customers saw revenue collapse by more than 60%. Hotels in Montana and North Dakota reported occupancy rates falling to levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The economic impact reached $4.2 billion in lost revenue within 6 months. But the real transformation was occurring in sectors that American policymakers had completely overlooked. Canada supplies 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the United States. This is not generic crude that can be easily replaced. This is heavy crude specifically designed for the complex refineries of the American Midwest and Gulf Coast. These refineries cannot simply switch to lighter domestic shale oil without massive retooling investments that would require tens of billions of dollars and years of construction. When the 15% energy tariff was imposed, American refineries saw their input costs spike immediately. They did not absorb this cost. They passed it directly to consumers. By summer 2025, drivers in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin were paying an additional 41 cents per gallon solely because of the Canadian energy tariff. The political consequences were immediate. Republican governors in swing states publicly broke with the administration. Industry associations representing sectors dependent on Canadian inputs issued statements calling the tariffs economically destructive. When your own political allies are condemning your signature policy, you have lost control of the narrative. While Washington struggled with the domestic political fallout, something remarkable was happening in Ottawa. Following Justin Trudeau's resignation in early 2025, Canada turned to Mark Carney, the former Bank of Canada governor who had guided the country through the 2008 financial crisis, and later served as the first non-British governor of the Bank of England. Carney's response was not emotional retaliation or public confrontation. It was strategic infrastructure development designed to make Canadian prosperity independent of American market access. The centerpiece was the $1.2 trillion sovereignty investment program announced in Budget 2025. This was not deficit spending for social programs or political constituencies. This was capital expenditure, specifically allocated to build the physical infrastructure needed to redirect Canadian trade away from American markets. $340 billion was allocated to east-west transportation corridors that would connect Canadian resource production directly to Pacific and Atlantic ports, bypassing American territory entirely. Another $280 billion went to critical mineral processing facilities that would add value to Canadian resources domestically rather than shipping raw materials to American manufacturers. But the most strategically significant investment was $180 billion committed to the Arctic Gateway Initiative, centered on the port of Churchill in Manitoba. For decades, Churchill has been dismissed as a remote northern outpost, known primarily for polar bear tourism. But Carney understood what American strategists had missed. Churchill is the only deep-water Arctic port in North America, with direct rail connections to the continental interior. As climate change opens northern shipping routes, Churchill becomes the most strategically valuable port on the continent. The geometry is undeniable. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers by using Churchill rather than traditional routes through the St. Lawrence Seaway or American Gulf ports. That represents 12 days of reduced transit time and approximately $620,000 in fuel savings per voyage. In an industry where margins are measured in pennies per ton, this is a revolutionary competitive advantage. The Hudson Bay Railway, a single line of track running nearly 1,000 kilometers from Winnipeg to the Arctic coast, was transformed from a regional freight line into a strategic national asset. $67 billion in upgrades, installed thermal protection systems to preserve permafrost stability, automated switching technology, and grain terminals capable of loading 100,000-ton vessels in continuous operations. By September 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship docked at Churchill, loaded with Canadian wheat destined for Germany. The symbolism was unmistakable. Canadian goods were reaching European markets without touching American infrastructure, American ports, or American transportation networks. Market responses were immediate. Canadian wheat futures increased 23%, as European buyers recognized they could source directly from Canada without American intermediaries. Potash prices, where Canada controls nearly half of global reserves, spiked 31% as fertilizer companies scrambled to secure supply agreements that bypassed American distribution systems. But infrastructure alone does not create sovereignty. Carney understood that true independence required diplomatic diversification. While Trump was alienating traditional allies, Canada was quietly building a coalition of partners who recognized that North American trade no longer needed to flow exclusively through American channels. Comprehensive trade agreements were signed with the European Union, integrating Canadian companies into European defense supply chains worth $244 billion. This was not just commerce. This was a signal that if the United States retreated from NATO commitments, Canada had alternative security relationships. The Asia-Pacific strategy was equally sophisticated. Bilateral trade agreements with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand targeted the 700 million person ASEAN market with combined GDP exceeding $4.8 trillion. The message was clear. Canadian resources could reach global markets without American permission. Even the relationship with China was recalibrated with surgical precision. In November 2025, Carney met with President Xi Jinping in what both leaders described as a strategic reset. Without endorsing China's political system, Canada positioned itself as a pragmatic middle power, willing to trade with all parties while serving as proxy for none. This neutrality allowed Canadian companies to maintain access to both American and Chinese markets, while their American competitors were forced to choose. The results speak for themselves. By the end of 2025, Canadian exports to the European Union were up 34% year over year. Exports to Asia increased by 28%. Meanwhile, American agricultural exports were declining as international buyers found alternative suppliers who did not subject them to political uncertainty. The most telling indicator came from private equity flows. Foreign investment in Canadian logistics infrastructure jumped 340% in the final quarter of 2025. Global capital was voting with its money, betting that Canada, not the United States, represented stability and growth in North America. All of these economic maneuvers were building toward a single date, July 1st, 2026. This is the mandatory review point for the USMCA trade agreement, where all three countries must decide whether to renew the agreement for another 16 years. Trump had viewed this deadline as a weapon. 18 months of tariffs and economic pressure would bring Canada to the negotiating table, desperate for a deal on any terms. The assumption was that Canada's economy would be damaged enough that Canadian officials would accept American demands rather than face continued isolation. Instead, as the review date approaches, the panic is visible not in Ottawa, but in Washington. The December 2025 U.S. Trade Representative hearings revealed the extent of American corporate desperation. Over 3 days, 147 business leaders testified, begging the administration not to destroy trade relationships. The American Apple Association warned that losing Canadian market access would bankrupt thousands of orchards. The Automotive Policy Council demonstrated that individual car components crossed the border 7 times during production, meaning that 25% tariffs on each crossing would add $1,400 to the cost of American-made vehicles. Ford's quarterly earnings report cited supply chain disruptions for $1.44 billion in losses. General Motors closed 2 Michigan assembly plants because Canadian steel and aluminum components had become prohibitively expensive. Trade economists began drawing historical parallels. Lawrence Summers noted that the situation resembled the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which triggered a global trade war and deepened the Great Depression. Carney has demonstrated what happens when a sophisticated economy refuses subordinate status, Summers wrote. During the Depression, American tariffs prompted trading partners to build entirely new networks bypassing the United States. Today's dynamic is identical. This brings us to the core dynamic that explains why Trump's strategy has backfired so spectacularly. Leverage in international relations is not determined by the size of your economy. It is determined by alternatives. For 8 decades, the United States maintained dominance over Canada by ensuring that Canada had no choice but to sell to American markets and buy American goods. That monopoly is now broken. Canada has built alternative supply chains, alternative customers, and alternative infrastructure. Mark Carney can walk into the USMCA review with a portfolio of signed trade agreements and a unified country behind him. He can say, "We want partnership, but we have built the capacity to survive without it. Can you say the same?" The United States, meanwhile, faces a $1.6 trillion hole in its economy if USMCA collapses. Half of that trade involves intermediate goods that fuel American manufacturing. Unlike Canada, the United States has not spent the last 18 months building alternative relationships. It has spent that time alienating existing partners. The mathematics are brutal for American negotiators. The United States imports $429 billion worth of goods from Canada annually. American manufacturers designed their production systems around North American supply chains. Replacing those relationships would require years and hundreds of billions in capital investment. Canada, by contrast, has already begun that replacement process. This is not a crisis. It is a reordering. What we are witnessing is not the collapse of American influence through military defeat or economic catastrophe. We are witnessing the quiet transfer of leverage from a country that assumed its dominance was permanent to a country that recognized when the foundation of that dominance had been removed. The infrastructure being built today is permanent. The trade relationships being forged are sticky. Even if a future American administration offers to return to the previous arrangement, the diversification will not simply reverse itself. The Canadian executive who spent 2 years developing supply chains in Vietnam is not going to abandon them for the convenience of American buyers. More importantly, trust has been broken. In international relations, as in business, trust is the most valuable currency. When you classify your allies' products as security threats, when you weaponize economic relationships for political theater, you do not get to simply reset the relationship when it becomes convenient. What we are seeing is the birth of a new kind of power, not a power of aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, but a power of geography, resources, and strategic positioning. Canada controls the world's longest coastline, 20% of global fresh water, and the keys to Arctic passages that will define 21st century trade routes. The warming Arctic has transformed Canada's northern coast from a frozen barrier into a highway. The Northwest Passage, blocked by ice for most of human history, now offers shipping routes that cut thousands of kilometers off journeys between Europe and Asia. Unlike the Suez Canal or Panama Canal, which can be blocked or controlled by hostile powers, the Northwest Passage runs through Canadian territorial waters. This geographic advantage is becoming a geo-economic weapon. Every ship that refuels at Churchill, every ton of grain loaded at Hudson Bay, strengthens Canada's legal claim to Arctic sovereignty while transforming theoretical map lines into physical reality. The United States finds itself in an unprecedented position, economically dependent on a country it has chosen to treat as adversarial. American refineries need Canadian oil. American manufacturers need Canadian aluminum. American agriculture needs Canadian fertilizer. This dependency was manageable when Canada had no alternatives. It becomes a strategic vulnerability when Canada can sell to the highest bidder in global markets. The irony is profound. In attempting to reduce American dependence on foreign nations, Trump has actually increased American vulnerability by creating a more independent Canada. The quiet neighbor to the north, which had been content to remain in America's economic orbit, has been pushed into building its own gravitational field. By the time this dynamic is widely acknowledged, it will already be normal. The Canadian steel mill that spent months certifying for German automotive specifications will not abandon that relationship because Washington changes policy. The European company that invested in Canadian mineral processing will not exit that partnership because American tariffs are lifted. History does not reverse because it was misunderstood. Power moved while people were watching other things. The newspapers focused on political drama. The analysts debated election implications. And beneath all that noise, the actual architecture of North American economics was quietly dismantled and rebuilt. There is no announcement for this kind of change, no ceremony, no moment where one country formally acknowledges that it no longer controls what it once controlled. There is only the slow recognition, spreading through corporate boardrooms and government ministries, that the assumptions which shaped policy for generations no longer describe reality. Canada does not need American permission anymore, and there is no mechanism, diplomatic or economic, to restore a dependency that a country has deliberately chosen to eliminate.